children and education in the 18th century. During the late 17th century, many infants began to die due to dehydration. Many of whom survived infancy only went on to die in their childhood. As dangerous as being an infant was, childbirth was even more dangerous. It not only posed a risk to the child, but to the mother as well. Women who bore 6 children faced a risk of dying in childbirth between 5 to 10%. Many mothers died from blood loss and shock as well as infection due to the unsanitary conditions. Due to many deaths surrounding pregnancy, the joy of pregnancy was overshadowed by the death of mother or child. Many mothers began to breastfeed their children, which led to a decrease in pregnancy due to ovulation delays. Nursing basically saved lives of mothers and children. Women belonging to the lower class breastfed their own children, while upper class women felt that breastfeeding was undignified, and therefore hired wet nurses to suckle their child. Wet nursing was a widespread and flourishing business in the 18th century in which women were paid to breastfeed other women's babies. Women working in cities had to rely on wet nurses because they did not have the time to nurse on their own. It took about 2 or 3 years for a wet nurse to finish her task. Wet nursing was more common in northern France, and by the end of the 18th century, 20,000 babies were born in Paris per year, making half of those babies be placed with wet nurses. 20–25% of babies went to Parisian nurses that were personally selected. Another 20–25% were abandoned in foundling hospitals. The remaining 10% were nursed at home by mothers or live-in nurses. The huge reliance on wet nurses led to high levels of infant mortality due to the dangers of travel, lack of supervision of conditions in wet nurses' homes, and the need to share milk between a wet nurse's own baby and the baby she was hired to feed. By the second half of the 18th century, critics were harshly attacking the practice of wet nursing. Enlightenment thinkers proclaimed that wet nursing was robbing society of reaching its full potential. They believed that the population was declining, which was incorrect because it was actually rising, and blamed it on women's failure to nurture their children properly. Despite this, women had no choice but to rely on wet nurses until the 19th century, when sterilized cow's milk and artificial nipples were introduced. During this time, abortions were illegal and rare. Single, pregnant ladies would have to hide their pregnancies and give birth in the countryside, which led to them smothering their babies. This was called infanticide. If caught, they would be punished by death. An alternative to infanticide was putting their baby in a foundling home/hospital in the city. Foundling homes/hospitals were equivalent to orphanages. They began in Italy, Spain, and Portugal in the 16th century, and spread to France and the rest of Europe in the 18th century. Foundling homes and hospitals were created by governments to prevent infanticide and the abandonment of infants on the streets. They admitted 100,000 babies annually in England, and 50–90% died after their first year. These homes were viewed as a Christian charity, but they can also be viewed as legalized infanticide. Throughout the Enlightenment, the views and attitude towards children changed dramatically. Before the Enlightenment, many parents did not care about their children. Most parents tried not to have a relationship with their children. This is due to a large amount of children that died at a young age. Many children died due to disease or neglect. However, as medicine got better, and the amount of food available went up, children began to live longer, and so parents started to care more for their children. Another thing that changed was discipline for children. During the 18th century, children were beaten severely for not obeying. Most parents followed this practice, and it resulted in a negative attitude towards children. However, after and during the Enlightenment, parents learned and decided that beating their children was not the best way to teach them to obey. Enlightened thinkers ridiculed the practice of swaddling babies, and advocated for parents to put their children in comfortable clothes instead of corsets. Mothers were also told to breastfeed their children themselves, instead of giving their children to wet nurses who did not care for them. One of the century's most influential works on children was JeanJacques Rousseau's A Miller on Education, 1762. Rousseau argued that boys should be taught craft skills in addition to book learning, while young women had to be schooled on their future domestic responsibilities. His ideas were based on his belief that women's nature destined them solely for a life of marriage and child-rearing. Though he was very influential, Rousseau would receive backlash from other Enlightenment thinkers for his belief that child-rearing would create a better society. Education became more available during the early modern period. The 16th century education was for the wealthy, often led by Jesuits in Catholic areas. The second half of the 17th century saw the rise of schools meant for teaching the common people. These schools taught kids, aged 6 through 12, literature, religion, arithmetic to boys, and needlework for girls. Although the amount of education increased in the 18th century, there were not enough schools to teach the masses. Religion played a big role in education. Scotland believed the path to salvation lay in studying the scripture. They set up many parish schools to educate the rich and the poor. The Church of England set up charity schools to teach the poor children. Prussia strongly believed in universal education. They were influenced by the Protestant idea that every believer should read the Bible and that the population would be able to serve the state. They were the first nation to make attendance mandatory for girls and boys in areas that had schools. In the 1660s, France set up charity schools run by parish priests to teach religion, reading, and writing. The expansion of education in German states influenced a greater support for popular education in the Habsburg Empire. Maria Theresa issued a mandatory education edict that required 5 hours of school, 5 days a week, for boys and girls aged 6 through 12 in 1774. Across Europe, elementary education was becoming a part of a child's life.